How do you keep your local bank in your own country from closing your bank accounts? You would think that that's impossible. It's your right to have an account at Chase or Westpac or Barclays. They couldn't possibly shut you down. You're a citizen. It's almost your right to do so. Except that's not the case. It's not your right to have a bank account. And now scores of people in the United States and other Western countries are having their bank accounts closed down for reasons they don't even know. I'm going to tell you how you can prevent this. I'm going to give you commentary on how you might want to diversify. And I'm going to tell you how to make sure that you're bulletproof from whatever happens with banks or anyone else in your country. So there's actually an article a couple months ago from the New York Times, of all places, that asked that very question, how to keep your bank from closing all your accounts. This came on my radar because Nigel Farage is speaking at Nomad Capitalist Live this September in Kuala Lumpur. I invited him for the specific reason that he had his bank accounts closed. And the initial thought was, well, it was a commercial decision. He didn't have enough money. It turned out later it wasn't. They just didn't like the guy. Now, you may not be as well known as Nigel Farage. You may think that you're safe. Well, the New York Times says that banks have suddenly shut down the accounts of scores of customers. I'm going to tell you how this actually happened to me as well. Here's how you can avoid being one of them. And the article says having a checking account is a privilege, not a right. Most people forget this until they lose access to their accounts. You think, hey, I live in the United States, I live in Australia, I live in Germany. You just have a bank account. It's something that you do. It's not until you kind of come into the nomad capitalist realm where, yes, there are countries like Georgia or Singapore or anything in between that open accounts for non-residents, but you realize many countries don't want to open accounts for non-residents. By the way, kind of a reason I think you should have more residence permits and passports is to allow yourself more financial diversification by having that residence stamp of approval. Means you have access to more banks, access to more investments. Not a bad thing to have. But you realize in the grand scheme of things, banks are very particular with who they want to take. And according to the New York Times, the security software that banks use to sniff out criminal activity is often easily frightened. And a lot of people get caught up in this. It sets off millions of alarms across the industry each year. Most of them are false. Now, here's why this matters to you, the nomad capitalist. You might be an investor, you might be an entrepreneur, you might have some kind of irregular income. Let me tell you why this matters. Because the closures often happen without warning and chaos ensues and people lose access to their money for weeks and can't pay their bills. The bank might freeze your money while they're figuring out how to get it back to you. But among what they call an increasing number of warnings that banks are following up on, the article recommends, and what I would tell you is that you have to put yourself in the shoes of a fraud analyst at your bank. If it's not a local credit union or a single branch community bank, they have no idea who you are. That's one reason why I kind of like banking in some of the more boutique jurisdictions overseas. You actually get to know someone. They often kind of work on a kind of assembly line, says the article, where they must meet a daily quota of alerts. They have to find enough potential criminal activity. It's like, it can't be that, hey, maybe people are just generally not conducting. No, we have to find a minimum of things to go after. And so these people handling the alerts have to go through enough of these alerts. The prompts come frequently from the surveillance software that banks monitor to use your transactions. And basically what they say is in a perfect world, your checking account balance, your current account balance looks like the teeth of a saw. A lump sum, I'm not sure what that means, a lump sum of income shows up, someone's going to leave a comment, the teeth of a saw. Okay. Money comes in on a regular schedule, you spend it over a period of weeks, and then the same amount repeatedly shows up. Ideally, the money comes by direct deposit from an employee that the bank employees can look up in 10 seconds if they've never heard of it. Plenty of people do not have tidy financial lives like that. The algorithms have neither sympathy nor empathy. But as we saw in the case of Nigel Farage, neither do some of the folks working at the bank. What I said when the Nigel Farage issue came out last year was, I highly doubt that a bank in Montenegro, where I ran into Nigel Farage before he spoke at Nomad Capitalist Live 2022, I highly doubt that in Montenegro, yes, he could be a past politically exposed person. That's something that makes it a little more difficult. But they don't really care his thoughts on Brexit. It's not their country. It's not their problem. And there's nothing wrong. I mean, you can be for Brexit. You can be for anti-Brexit. You could have voted for Brexit and now say it was a terrible deal. He'll talk about it at Nomad Capitalist Live. You can ask him. But that probably shouldn't be the reason for denying someone a bank account in a country that claims it's a democracy and people have freedom of speech. And we're kind of seeing some of the veneer come off the Western countries that claim those things and use that to act holier than thou to the kind of places that we talk about. By the way, we help our clients plenty of democracies, nothing wrong with that. But if you're not banking in the UAE or in Singapore because like, oh, they're very heavy-handed over there. It's like, oh, okay, well in the UK, the government doesn't even have to be heavy-handed. Sometimes the bank employees just do it for them. So there's no sympathy or empathy from the algorithm or sometimes from the bankers. The solution from my perspective is go somewhere where they just don't care. And I'm the goody two-shoes of the offshore world. We do background checks on the people we work with. If people come in doing squirrely stuff, we send them off. Who's that guy making the videos in front of an old shower curtain? Let him call him. Nothing wrong with supporting legal things, and the bank just doesn't like it. You should be able to have a bank account somewhere. And so fortunately, there's 252 sovereign countries and autonomous jurisdictions around the world, and most of them have banks. You can go there. Some are better than others, of course. But that's the solution. Go where they don't need to have sympathy or empathy because they don't care. Now, obviously, part of this is I had a Capital One account in the U.S. It was originally ING Direct. I was a kid. I had a savings account. Turned into Capital One. I ended up having a Capital One credit card. One day, I get an email. We closed. I forget if it was the credit card first or the savings account first. And I called, like, what's going on? And of course, it's always like, we don't have to tell you. Leave us alone. How dare you? And then I'm like, does this affect the other one? They're like, absolutely not. What's your problem? An hour and a half later, I'm at dinner at my favorite Peruvian restaurant here in Bogota. Get the thing, the other one's closed. Of course, these people they know nothing of what they speak, and they're the ones in charge of your accounts. I would imagine it's because I was paying for a few Peruvian dinners and other sundry items around Bogota in Colombia, and that's not their teeth. I still don't know what the hell they mean, teeth of a saw, but that does not fit the teeth of the saw. Now, I have a semi-regular. Well, I don't have, that wasn't a checking account, so I wouldn't have a regular income. I just would have had money that would have been saved and it would have been paid from a checking account. But that's not the normal profile. I do think that a lot of like U.S. credit cards and other international, Western countries, UK, Ireland, Australia, they're getting a little bit better at realizing that countries around the world have something to offer. I think that at one point, JP Morgan Chase, you couldn't use their credit cards or debit cards in Malaysia because of a high fraud risk. It's like I live in Malaysia part-time. I've never heard of a high fraud risk. It's not really a fraud country. Kind of shows they don't know what they're doing in JP Morgan Chase. But I think most, people who come to Nomad Capitalist Live this year in Kuala Lumpur will have no problems using their cards. So they're getting better, but maybe Colombia is a step too far for a bank like Capital One. So that is an issue if you're living a nomadic lifestyle. That's, again, a reason why you want to have diversified accounts. I've said, I've looked at an emerging market like Egypt, for example. I think there's opportunities there. Not through an ETF in the U.S. stock market, but directly in Egypt. And you know what? My bank in the U.S. might not give me any grief over that because they know me well enough and they kind of know what I do. But a lot of banks would. And obviously I have banks all over the world. I probably wouldn't even try. My Singapore bank, they probably would be a little weirded out. But if you have a bank in Dubai, for example, they understand Egypt. They have people who live in Egypt that have accounts at their bank, right? And so if you're investing in or spending or living in certain places, you might want some kind of regional bank. I've often told you, if you go down to Mexico to live, maybe you get a small Mexican bank account, but that shouldn't be where most of your money is. Maybe you get some other account in the region that understands Mexico. So for people who travel, for people who live overseas part or full time, you want to have banks that deal with you in that way and that kind of understand where you're spending money. But the bigger challenge here is that banks are doing all kinds of things. This is, again, more focused on the U.S., and I actually think all banks are going to ask you some kinds of questions. There's compliance, obviously, everywhere in the world. Certain banks, they don't get all uptight about certain stuff. It says checks are now a red flag. I just closed down a bank account that I had in Canada. I had it for years. For the last 2 years, I'm like, I got to close this bank account. I'll get to it tomorrow. They can only send me a draft, which is like a check. And it comes to my address, and then I forward it to a bank, and then they cash the check. Apparently, that's a red flag now. I just closed a bank account, and I get a draft. Apparently, checks are a red flag. So the banks have all these kinds of things that, because other bad people are doing stuff, you get lumped in with them. And that's how it's always worked to a certain extent. But what we're seeing is they're taking it too far in some cases. I had another online savings account when I was a U.S. citizen that was closed because I just logged in too much from overseas. Schwab, a lot of people talk, Schwab, it's the best. I have so many people who are permanent overseas residents have their Schwab accounts in the U.S. closed. I think this is largely a U.S. problem in terms of U.S. banks freaking out. I've told you the story many times about how when I sold my house in the U.S. many, many years ago, and the title officer asked where I wanted the proceeds sent. I said Singapore, and she said, "What's that?" I don't know that bankers in a lot of other countries would ask, "What's that?" to Singapore. So I think the U.S. and maybe Canada are probably pretty isolated, maybe Australian banks too. You're not going to have some of these issues where you go to Malaysia and they freeze your account if you bank pretty much anywhere else on earth. But if you are in a place like Colombia or Mexico, there might be more banks, and you want to be able to deal with that. But the bigger issue for me is, forget where you travel. And by the way, we have plenty of wealthy clients who they spend I just met a guy today, spends 4 months a year in Colombia, and he loves it, and get millions of dollars. So this affects more people than you think. But the bigger issue then is, okay, what do they put in the system? Do they try and stop people from going to some of these places? Do they try and make it harder? And the answer is you want to have multiple bank accounts before you need it. So listen, do not take this as tax advice, but generally speaking, if you're an American, you have the actual benefit that you can keep some of your U.S. bank accounts from a tax perspective, not necessarily from the bank's perspective, but you have a little bit more flexibility in keeping bank accounts than, let's say, a Canadian or an Australian who leaves for tax purposes. And so a lot of Americans that I've seen are like, well, if I can use the U.S. bank account, why get something else? Well, because they're a little, quick on the trigger sometimes. And because who knows what policies are applied to stop otherwise legal behavior. There's nothing wrong, there's nothing illegal about trying to cash a check. Nothing wrong with trying to, buy empanadas in Colombia. There's nothing wrong with even moving money in from a crypto exchange, unless it's illegal where you live. Those things are all legal. And yet the banks, because they're afraid of certain governments where they do business, they do this. They close people's accounts. And then again, they use it to where there's a system, kind of like what you've seen in the past from some of the folks in Silicon Valley on things like social media. There's a system where, if we don't like you, we could close your account. You want to go to a place where they understand and they appreciate where you're going, what you spend money on. Perhaps you have a personal relationship with someone at the bank to where you can get more flexibility because they understand, hey, you're not the bad guy. And you want to have diversified banks to where you make sure that you are ready before you need them. This, to me, is just part of an asset protection plan. And if you're in crypto, which obviously has done very well this year, you want a place to put that crypto if you want to buy something. Because if you want citizenship for buying real estate or residence for buying real estate in some countries, it might have to go into a local bank first. And so these are all things that you want to keep in mind. But we say go where you're treated best. Those are the 5 magic words. Don't tolerate what happens where you live. Go where you're treated best. And depending on where you live, especially in the United States, if you open a bank account somewhere else, you might have to file a form. It's not that hard if you know the right people. We have people who can do that for you. We have lots of tax experts from all around the world. So go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. I think the next logical step is if you're going to have banking overseas, just live overseas. Dramatically reduce your taxes. We help people do that. We help people open bank accounts all over the world. We help people with more complex asset protection plans, setting up trusts and where does the stuff go. And we've got all the professionals all around the world to help you. We put the puzzle pieces together under one roof. But if you want to make sure your bank account's safe, you can't just rely on your country because either the bank or the government could do something to it. And we're seeing that happen. Even the New York Times is talking about it, and Nigel Farage is going to be talking about it at Nomad Capitalist live in Kuala Lumpur this September.